Hey guys, you're listening to episode 140 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Keelan, and I'm here with my co-host and brother Cody. Today, we're talking to Jesse and Krista Casler. Jesse is the Chief Operating Officer of Hope International, having served Hope over the last 20 years. Together, Jesse and Krista have allowed generosity to touch nearly every part of their lives. Their stories touched on many aspects of the generous life, from financial accountability to foster care and generosity of the home, to donor-advised funds and charitable bunching. But above all, their lives are marked by a deep joy in everything that they do. Before we get started, we've spent years speaking to and learning from some of the most passionate givers and leaders in the world. We've distilled down some of the most impactful frameworks, strategies, and tools into short weekly emails that leave you with practical ways you can take your generosity journey to the next level. If you aren't on the list already, you can sign up for free at finishlinepledge.com. And with that, let's get started. All right, we're here today with Jesse and Krista Casler. Guys, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, our pleasure to be here.
So why don't you guys just get us started off telling us a little bit about maybe some of your early years, including some of your faith backgrounds?
Yeah, I can start. So I grew up in a small town in northwestern Pennsylvania near Lake Erie. My parents moved to Quincy, Massachusetts on the South Shore of Boston when I was in high school. So finished high school there, went to college at a small Christian liberal arts school called Eastern Nazarene College, started my career in banking at State Street Bank there in Quincy, ended up going to Boston University for grad school, an MBA and a master's degree in international relations. When I learned about microfinance and especially Christ-centered microfinance, ended up joining the team at Hope International, and that's been 20 years ago now. So my family was a Christian family growing up. Born on Saturday and church on Sunday kind of family, and we were there Wednesday nights, Sunday nights, Sunday mornings, of course. And we're just very involved in the church all the way along. Grew up in the Church of the Nazarene, and it was a very meaningful experience for me. Very involved in Bible quizzing and youth group and just all of that came with that. Like a lot of people, as you get older, you start deciding if you want to make this faith your own. And I certainly found that when I was in college, a deepening and a personalization of that faith, and really deciding, this was for my parents. Is it for me? And of course, deciding, yes, that this definitely was something that I wanted to be about and wanted to define my life as well.
Yeah, for me, I grew up with an English mother. She grew up on a small farm in the south of England, and a Yankee American father from New England in the U.S., in a pastor's family. My dad, for various reasons, ended up having a call to ministry after he was already in his 20s, and ended up going to seminary in London. For unusual story. My mother, in an unusual story of her own, ended up taking Bible classes there, and they met and married. I was born in this country. They'd come back here by the time they started having kids. But yeah, I grew up in a pastor's home, grew up almost literally in the church. Whenever the doors were open, we kids were along for the ride. Yeah, and that was just an incredibly important and formational part of who I was. It was just part of our DNA, right? Mm-hmm. And like Jesse, was at Eastern Nazarene College, a Christian college, and went on from there for graduate programs at Boston University. But yeah, a lot of great foundation was laid in my home, and I'm so thankful for the example that I had from my mom and dad in early years.
Jesse and Krista, how did the two of you meet?
Well, we started dating in college. We both were part of the Nazarene denomination and on the same New England district. So especially by our senior year, our youth groups had done common things together. We had done a big youth conference that both of our youth groups were part of, summer camp, and had gotten to know one another through that and had plenty of mutual friends. We ended up in the same freshman class together. We went for ice cream at Friendly's first week freshman year. We were married the summer after we graduated. So we were together. Jesse always jokes, yes, we were that couple. Yeah. And interestingly, though, is it old fashioned to say, our courtship was very much working together. We ended up being really, both of us, involved in student government and a lot of different activities. And so I feel like our relationship was very much forged in just learning how to work side by side with each other and how to set common goals and how to pull things off like that. And that was just a really important part of what I think, solidified or kind of incubated our relationship in the early days. And I think that's continued to be true. Here we are over 25 years, married now. I don't know if you'd add anything to that, Jesse.
Yeah, you said it well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jesse, you mentioned that you've been involved with Hope since pretty much the early days. And, we've had the pleasure of having Jeff Rutt back on episode 64, and then Peter Greer as well back on episode 71. So we're just really building out the Hope family here, which is really cool. But maybe for those who are listening who are not familiar with Hope International, maybe you can give kind of a little overview of the mission of Hope and the kind of programs that you guys do to accomplish that mission.
Well, I'm glad you already talked to Peter and Jeff. Those are just really special, very unique people. And I'm glad you've been able to share some of their story too. So yeah, Hope International, when I started, there were 3 of us full-time in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where our main office is. So it was me, Peter, and another guy. And Peter was the CEO. The other guy was a guy named Quentin, who was the fundraiser, and I did everything they didn't want to do. So it's just been a really fun journey to be part of. So yeah, Hope's mission is to invest in the dreams of families in the world's underserved communities as we proclaim and live the gospel. And how we do that is through Christian microfinance and savings groups, partnering with the local church and some training activities as well. So, we really focus on doing those few things with excellence. It might be a commentary on us, but we find it hard enough to do those 2 things with excellence, savings groups and microfinance. And we really have tried to bring that all around the world. We started in Ukraine in the mid-90s, and it went very well there. And the board said, how can we turn this into an international network of Christ-centered programs doing this kind of work around the world? And really, for those who may not be familiar with microfinance, I usually say, think of it like a bank. Loan officers, tellers, savings accounts, business loans, all that same stuff, just customized for people living in material poverty.
Yeah, I always love hearing about some of these massive organizations in the early days and just seeing how much God has done over that time. You've really had a front row seat to seeing a lot of that work happen, watching God firsthand just kind of shape Hope and really the whole kind of microfinance movement all the way from, those were pretty early microfinance days in general. But I'd love to hear, from your perspective, what have been some of the highlights that you've been able to see God do over the years?
We often talk at Hope about Ephesians chapter 3 and seeing God do more than we could possibly ask or imagine. And I think of that story often. When Peter and I first started, if we had tried to dream up and chart out where this would go, we would have never guessed at how much God has been able to do and accomplish through this organization. It's just been really fun to be part of. And really the group of people he's brought around this organization, whether it's supporters, board members, staff members, clients, and people we serve around the world, it's just extraordinary to get to be part of. And I'll give you one example just from last week. I was in Rwanda, and we, on our strategic plan, we have one of our pillars is frontiers. We want to expand our reach to particularly people who would be seen as marginalized on the fringe. You even go to a country like Burundi, one of the poorest countries in the world, and you say, in Bujumbura, in the capital, who are the marginalized in this country? They'll turn and point and say, the Batwa. Now, those people are really poor, right? So we all have these marginalized groups, and we've tried to say, well, what can we do to reach out to those groups that traditionally would be disenfranchised? And so last week I was in Rwanda and visiting with one of these groups, and this was a group that was visually impaired, and they had formed a group and were getting microfinance loans to do different types of business activity. And, they said some things that really stuck with me. One, they said, no other financial institution has come to us. No one. You're the only ones who have come and sought us out. And one of the women in the group stood up and said, Hope's program on the ground has brought the medicine for the illness that we had. And the illness was aloneness. Sometimes we think about people living in poverty, we think about material things, money, not enough money. And for her, yes, that was probably part of the equation, but there was a social element to that too, to her poverty, that she did not have community, that she felt isolated and alone. And because of this group now, she had a group of people around her that was supporting her and encouraging her and equipping her. So I could tell you story after story just like that of the ways we've seen God move to just really impact a lot of people, millions of families all around the world at this point.
So over this time, you have had really the chance to interact with many different communities who are just facing really challenging circumstances. And I'd love to hear, what are some of the things you wish more people understood about addressing systematic poverty in the world? What are some of the biggest misconceptions and just kind of the framework shift that needs to happen for us as givers to really, have everything aligned correctly and to actually be helpful in what we, how we try to help?
I think I'd build on what I said in the last piece. I hope we talk about impact in 4 different domains, and those are personal, spiritual, social, and material. And I think as Americans, we tend to go right to the last one, material, right? Poverty means a lack of financial goods or, financial means or stuff. And yeah, that's part of it. But if you listen to, people around the world talk and describe poverty, it often is those other terms. It's, I felt alone. I felt isolated. I felt unseen, unknown. I didn't feel valued. I didn't see any value in God's eyes in me. These kinds of things, this brokenness that often comes with poverty. And so, the way we design our programs are meant to try to address all of those areas, not just you have more money. I mean, frankly, sometimes you can have more money and it just creates more problems, right? So, we want to really look at people holistically and help come alongside them as they grow in their knowledge and understanding of themselves in each of those areas. So yeah, I think that's a part of it. Of course, the other big piece is we tend to come in with solutions, right? And especially Americans, we find solutions, that's our thing. And, sometimes we need to pause a little bit and listen and be willing to listen and see what's already working in this community. How's God already at work here? And maybe we can learn from that. And as we design some of the things we can implement to help address the situation, doing that in conjunction with the local team, with local people who understand the culture, understand the context, maybe much better than we do coming from outside.
Well, I heard once that our experiences inform our beliefs, and our beliefs determine our behavior. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how your experiences, both growing up and through the kind of work that you're describing, has informed how the two of you communicate and behave around your own personal finances.
When we got married, I mean, so many people, those first few years of marriage, they're like duking it out, right? They're fighting about stuff and they're figuring stuff out as they go. And for us, we just never really had that. Like, we have been on the same page about this, and it's such a blessing. Money issues can be such a divisive issue in marriage, and we've been very similar. And so maybe I'll talk a little bit about, how I came to the place where I'm at, and then Krista can describe her growing up and development in this area. And I think you'll see there's a lot of commonality between those stories. And so I remember when I got my first $100, this was just crazy to me, and I opened a bank account, and the idea that I could gain interest on this money, that this money would literally make more money for me. And there's a great book that combines the sayings of Ben Franklin on this idea of thrift. It's called On Industry, Frugality, and Thrift. Probably would not be a bestseller today. But, one of the things he says in there is that money is in its very nature prolific. Money begets money. And I think so often we've lost this whole idea of thrift, right? And we think money is for spending. And in reality that, money can help you make more money. So when I was graduating from high school, I'm the youngest of 3. My older siblings and I each got $3,000 from our grandparents when we graduated from high school. And my older sister went on a trip to Europe, and my older brother went on a trip to Europe, and I opened my first mutual fund. And so, it's just been part of my DNA. I've been very interested in personal finance and investing, and really trying to say, how can I save as much money and then put it to good use to create even more so that I can be generous with the world. There's a great sermon by John Wesley. I think it's sermon number 50 or 51. In fact, I think you had Elisa Huber on the show, and I think she mentioned this in the episode too, where he summarizes this as, make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And I really think that kind of summarizes my mentality as I've grown up, how I think about money.
Yeah. And that story, or what that Jesse's shared, I think resonates with me too. I mentioned already, I grew up in a pastor's home, and most people don't get into pastoring for the big paychecks in your average small town communities and churches. And certainly for my parents, we were not a wealthy family by a long shot. And it wasn't until well after I'd graduated from college, actually, and I had Pell Grants, and I didn't realize I just was glad I got the grants and didn't realize, these are for people who in the US are deemed as being, in poverty and deserving of this money. I had no idea. I didn't feel poor, so to speak, but we were very conscious of how our money was spent. And at the same time, living in generous ways and living in community with people within our faith community, doing and sharing life with them. So my own values, though, from a really early age was of being frugal, of being good stewards of whatever it was that we had, of certainly not wasting, of mending things, right? You do not live a wasteful lifestyle. I have parents who still now in their 70s can make, repair, do, fix anything, and kind of passed on that this is what you do. Why would you not live in a way that just is sustainable for the planet and sustainable on your pocketbook, right? And so I knew when I was really young, I'm not going to be able to afford to go to college. My parents won't be able to pay for me to go to college. I need to be saving every penny now if I want to go to college. And I knew I did. I was always a good student and knew I believed I was college material, but even at 9 or 10, I'm thinking I need to save so I can go to college, right? So this was a value that the way Jesse just talked about finances, I think we came together in similar ways. And because it was a priority for us and something I don't think either of us have ever seen talking about money as being as taboo as it often is for other people. Mm-hmm. Shortly after we got married, we formed a young adult group we were in the Boston area. We had friends who were also like us in graduate school, working on masters and PhDs. And within our group of friends, within the church community of other like young 20-somethings, we invited a few, and goodness knows why they said yes, but they agreed to join us in a financial accountability group. Because again, we were like, this should be stuff we talk about. And so we all committed for a couple of years, we kept this up of recording everything we spent, meeting once a month and showing other people every penny we spent. If we were contemplating a big purchase, asking these other couples, should we or shouldn't we, right? And then also pairing that with time to pray, time to discuss. The sermon Jesse just referenced was one we read through and talked about in that group 25 years ago. And we would have vibrant discussions, not always agreeing. Is it better to just like live on the cusp of poverty and give away everything? Should we be amassing wealth, to protect ourselves for the future and also to be able to give more in the future? What should that look like, and how do we discern, the Lord's will in this, reading different scriptures in this way? So for me and Jesse, I think from really the start, this has been something we consider to be not so much not a challenge. Maybe I should say not a difficulty. We have felt it always is an ever-present joy and challenge to figure out how to steward what we have and how to do that even better and how to encourage other people to do that along with us and how to, instead of avoiding these topics and then maybe kind of getting in trouble, right, because of it or in debt or whatever, to be thinking about what might God be inviting us to do and how can we use what we have to further his kingdom. And you mentioned in your question, Keelan, also about how is hope and some of that work even modeled that. And I think, I'm a step removed. It's Jesse's career, not mine there. But certainly there's just this beautiful challenge to those of us living with so much, right? Living in the home and the lifestyle I'm able to have, to look at others with so little, and yet they themselves giving sacrificially to their neighbor, giving to and through their local church, finding ways somehow to still save for tomorrow. And goodness, if like the group Jesse was just talking about, a group of individuals living in great poverty, all of whom are blind or visually impaired, can talk about their capacity for saving and forgiving, good grief. How can I not also have some capacity for saving and giving, given what we have as a couple? So there might be other things we've butt heads on through the years, Jesse and I, but this fortunately has been one area where we have, I think, only spurred one another on.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear. And I think, probably across the board, finances has got to be one of the top, if not the top, divisive issue. And so already having that one aside is a huge win as a foundation in marriage. Now, you mentioned this accountability group that you guys spontaneously started, and we've talked to a lot of people, and that is still a lot of givers who have been giving for a long time, and that's still a very rare or unique kind of experience. And I don't think it should be, but it is. And so I'd love to hear just a little bit more of your experience through that. what were some of the things that you felt like you really took away from that as like, I might not have seen this if it wasn't for this group? And, what are even some of the challenges in, I'm sure people listening who this is like the first time they've ever heard that concept. They're like, I can think of a lot of challenges. That's not a hard one. But tell us a little bit more about what your experience with the group.
I think it was really helpful. Helpful to have another perspective on our finances, right? I mean, it didn't mean that they controlled our money, but it's helpful to have someone else speaking into that. I remember one couple in the group said, "Hey, we think we want to buy a new TV, and here's why." They kind of laid out the reasons, and the rest of the group were like, "I don't think you need that," and they were kind of like, you know what? Maybe we don't need it. Like sometimes when you get in your own head, you can justify almost anything, right? And especially if you're in the American context where you can always point to somebody else who's, well, like they got a way more than we do. Look at that car. Look at that house. And you can kind of justify up a lifestyle forever. But to have some control on that, right? Some people who can speak into that and maybe challenge you. We need to be challenged on this issue, right? I think that you mentioned earlier about the impact of being at Hope. This has been a real control for me, right? Like, just like Krista said, I sometimes even think, what if the people we served lived right outside my front door? How would I do things differently? How would I spend my money differently, my time differently? Yeah, pretty differently, right? And as much as I am in the field and meeting with those people, it's still easy for me to forget when I get back into an American context. So I think it's helpful for us to have some check on that and some balance to what the culture naturally propels us to, which is accumulating more and spending more and more.
In just thinking through some of the logistics of that, it seems like kind of finding people in a similar life stage or some similarities or overlap, or I don't know. But I'd love to hear, if somebody was, they're hearing this and they're like, you know what, I think I really need this in my life. Do you have any, quick tips that come to mind for how you would recommend somebody go about starting this, who to invite in, and maybe, what you actually share and discuss and what that kind of looks like?
It probably can, vary depending on the person and the group. And maybe I'd say if you're really nervous about this, start small. Maybe it's just a family member. Maybe it's your small group at church. Maybe it's just one trusted person. And maybe you don't share everything. Maybe you start by sharing some information in a summary way. I do a lot of personal financial advising for people, and I tell them, look, I can get into every detail with you, or I can just talk in big picture, and it's fine either way. And maybe you approach this group the same way. Like, let's just talk in big pictures first, and let's get to trust each other more. And, then you can maybe dig in deeper later. For us, we just started sharing everything, and, maybe it's partially like we didn't have that much. There wasn't much to share. So maybe that mattered too. And I think you're right. Like maybe some people in a similar stage of life, maybe it might be helpful because, there can be some weirdness. I think if you have people in very different stages of life, very different wealth levels and other pieces, that could be complicated. So I might say start with some people who are already trusted, you already know, or maybe in a similar situation, see if any of them would be interested in a mutual accountability group on this.
In terms of other practical tips, I think what you're saying there, Jesse, is so true about there needs to be some mutual trust, being thoughtful there. And I think, being somewhat similar in goals and in life stage also just practically makes sense. Early on when we were meeting in our first meeting or two, I recall us deciding, what level at which we wanted to get into this and then just making that commitment. We are going to record all of our expenses and we are going to show these every month. Be prepared. Keep it on a spreadsheet somewhere. And I think it was twofold benefit. First of all, we all know there's value just in tracking your expenses. When you actually pay attention to what's coming in and going out, you start to realize what's coming in and what's going out. So that in and of itself was helpful, just getting that practice. And then knowing that someone else was going to have eyes on it, right? And be able to speak into that. There's a real check on just sort of egregious discretionary spending, right? When you think someone is going to be saying, well, did you really need to do that or whatever? I think another, for us, practically important part of it, though, was that it wasn't just looking over numbers, but there was really wonderful discussion and it was grounded in our faith. And so also we would take turns, bringing a topic, bringing a scripture or a story or a passage, something that we could really chew on. And also I think that helped reinforce the why. that why would we care about this in the first place? And that this isn't just some exercise and just so we have more money in our pockets, but that this is something that we're doing for the glory of God and as our way to continue to be faithful in all aspects of our lives, including our finances. And so including that piece, I think, is essential.
I think there's a real power to something like a financial accountability group. And the reason is that unsolicited feedback can come off as a judgment, and there's real relational risk to providing unsolicited feedback. So often we withhold feedback, even when maybe it ought to be shared. And I think this applies in many areas. And in Paul's letters, he describes church accountability a couple different times. And he describes this process of if you observe something that's off in, a church member's life and how to address that. And I think that assumes that you know what's going on in their life. You have to be in relationship and in community with those people. And if you have stuff that never has other eyes on it, then it's really easy to kind of go your whole life without getting any feedback. And your perspective is kind of formed without the benefit of other people's perspectives that you might really value and benefit from. I'm interested to dive into how the two of you have thought about giving specifically. And when have there been moments where you don't see eye to eye, and how do you reconcile that?
I'm not sure I can really say there have been any cases of us fundamentally not seeing eye to eye when it came to giving. I think we've been on a pretty similar page on that. And I wish I could tell you it's because I was really smart and Krista and I talked about this. We ironed it out before we got married. I was just dumb lucky, really. And I've just been very fortunate with Krista as my spouse that we see eye to eye on that. I think, we've always been givers. I mean, I think we both saw modeled from our parents the importance of tithing. And also, I think giving of your time. I remember often my father reaching out to people who would have been considered on the margin for sure, and bringing them into the center and embracing them in many ways. And I noticed that growing up and observing that as a kid. So I think when we got married, it was just natural for us to give back from the earnings that we had. And we kept our expenses very low when we first got married. And this idea of saving as much as you can and giving as much as you can. But, the dollars were pretty small at that point. And I remember we were probably 27 or 28. Eastern Nazarene College had this ENC society where they were encouraging people to join the society, and it was making a commitment to give at least $1,000 a year to the school. And, for us at that point, that was a lot of money. And we were charter members of that group. And I think we just felt like this is just something that's really important. In addition to our tithe, we want to give in this way. But I remember probably, goodness, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, we'd been building and giving generously, but also saving and increasing our investments. And we started to think and dream about what could it be like to give a much bigger gift, And I remember the first time we committed to a $10,000 gift, and it just felt like, wow, that's a lot of money. I mean, we're a professor and a nonprofit worker. We're not making huge salaries here. And we just felt like, wow, it's actually really exciting to us, the idea that we could make a material difference. And I think working at Hope International, I had seen so many very wealthy people who were very generous. And when they could give larger amounts of money like this, it could really catalyze brand new things. And there's a role for the regular giving that kind of keeps the thing moving, but there can be a really impactful thing happening when a larger gift can be given to really start something new or catalyze something in a much bigger direction. So yeah, I think we love being the regular giver, but also being sensitive to the Holy Spirit when he might be leading us to give a little bit beyond even what we thought was our capacity to really catalyze something new or make something really impactful for someone.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, but what have been some of the domains of your giving? I know obviously you work with Hope, and I'm sure have a passion for helping those in poverty or some context like that. And that's where you spend a lot of your time. This also kind of gets to the interaction of time and money. Both can be related or also very different. And so what have kind of over the years been some of the kind of major areas of your giving?
Obviously international economic development just with my career. And, it's been something that we've been very involved in. We've already talked a lot about that, but a few other areas, we've really felt drawn to Christian higher education and college ministry in general. I can't tell you how many major supporters I've met from Hope International who came to faith in college, right? Whether it's through InterVarsity or Navigators or Young Life or, just a variety of things, or just on a Christian campus. It's so impactful, and we really want to support that. As we've gone on, we've kind of morphed or merged those two in some ways. We've really gotten connected to high-performing African scholars and trying to encourage and equip them to come to American universities and study there, Christian colleges particularly. Actually, one of the things we're really excited about, we've got two young women from a really top-performing school in Rwanda who are going to be coming this fall. Lord willing, pray for visas to come through, to come to an American college this fall that we're involved in. And it's actually the same school our son is going to this fall as well. So we're really excited about that. I was just able to meet with the girls last week, and they're just really excited about this. And so that's something. Another area of passion for us, both in time and money, is foster care. We've been very involved in foster care. We've been an emergency on-call family for our county for the last bunch of years. And we've had over 21 kids through our home in some form. Sometimes that's really short term, 2 or 3 days. Sometimes that's been as long as a year and a half. So that's just something we're passionate about as well. And of course, spend a lot of time when we have a child in our care.
Yeah. And as you can imagine with that list Jesse just gave, I think the things that get both of us most excited about giving is when we feel like giving in some way is like leveraging or catalyzing some other thing we also care about. So something like these two young women who were helping go to college, we think about having 3 kids in college next year, essentially. Our eldest, who's a high school senior, and then these 2 amazing young women from Rwanda. We love, right, is that this is an opportunity for these 2 young women that they didn't have in front of them. We're just so excited to get to be part of their story and just all that they're already doing and what we see the Lord is doing in their lives. But we're also excited that it's 2 new great students for an institution of higher education, a Christian college that desperately needs students, right? And we all know how many, schools are closing these days, especially smaller Christian schools. There's a lot of threat there and just a lot of headwinds and a lot of challenges. And so to help both of those, right, kind of missions or both of those goals succeed by bringing the 2 together, we get really excited about that, right? We think about this with not just also like our saving and our giving, but then also our spending. We try to be thoughtful. We shop at Walmart and Amazon like everybody else sometimes, right? But we're thoughtful when we can also have our spending be in line with our values. Where can we be supporting women-owned businesses and people of color and different things that are helping our own local communities to thrive and work better. And, since we do spend time in the world of foster care, we're very deeply aware of how much pain and brokenness is right literally on our doorstep and sometimes in our home. And so we think about what's out in the great wide world, and we also think about what's in our own neighborhood, or when we, drive down the street, who might be living on either side of that road. So we're really excited about things that bring all of that together when possible, but sometimes individually working in those different areas as well. Yeah, we haven't even spoken about the local church or whatever, but that's of course a big piece too.
Just hearing the 2 of you talk, it reminded me, Krista, you said in the beginning that your family growing up was very conscious of how money was used. And by the time you were getting ready to go to college, you said you didn't feel like you went without. Like you didn't have this mindset of we have less financial resources than we need. It was really, I could hear this sense of like fondness just thinking about your childhood. And I hear that coming through in the way that the 2 of you speak about all of the things that God has given you that you can use to be generous towards others. And it's beyond time and money. It's your home. It's your attention. It's your thoughtfulness. And okay, here's a couple areas that we're passionate about. How do we integrate all of that and channel our lives towards serving other people in that way? And I don't know a better way than through story to share that with other people, that this kind of life of contentment and deep like soul satisfaction is available through being generous. And it doesn't stop with writing a check. It's so much beyond that. And I think your story really captures that concept really well.
Yeah, I was even going to say, just in hearing you guys and related to that, I think probably if I had to estimate, a third to a half of the people that we've had on the podcast, this is like a generosity podcast, are involved in adoption or foster care in some context, because it just overflows into every part of your life when you begin maybe through financial generosity, but really get the mindset, and it just starts to kind of flow through you. I think, you just want to like leverage every part of what you have. You're like, all right, where do I have time? How can we use our home? How can we, use our family and stuff? And even just hearing all the different things that you guys are involved in is like an obvious demonstration of that. So, one of the things that we were talking about is you mentioned, being in the nonprofit world, but also a giver yourself, Jesse. I think sometimes there can be a short circuit that happens for people, obviously not for you guys, but where people in ministry or in the nonprofit world miss out on some of the joy of giving as well. And I don't know, like you guys have played this out so well in your life of both, being very involved in your career, but then also, being very involved in your personal life too. And I don't know if you have any, recommendations or thoughts for people that are in the ministry world and maybe don't think of themselves as a giver, but how those thought processes played out for you.
Yeah. I mean, the nonprofit industry is not known for excessive salaries. Let me say that. But I think when I do, personal finance is another passion of mine. And when I do talks with that, one of the things I focus on is there's so much focus and energy in the US about your income. If I only made a little bit more, then I would start saving. Then I would start. If I just made a little bit, and it doesn't matter if you make $100,000 a year, $200,000 a year, or $20,000 a year. Like it's always that. If I just made a little bit more, then I'll start. And the reality is, you probably have somewhat limited control over the income side, but you have a lot of control over the expense side. And I think I would say no matter, what your salary is, you can create distance between that income and expense. And it's through decisions you will make about your expenses. And that will be your engine for saving, for investing, and for giving. So I would encourage them to focus on that, how they can control expenses and create that distance. And it doesn't matter, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He doesn't need your money. He wants you to give with a joyful heart, and he has great plans for how he can use you in that. But it really doesn't matter so much about the amount. Don't get too caught up in that. Just be faithful with what you have and watch God put it to work. Maybe the other thing I would say to nonprofit workers is do your work with excellence. You are directly contributing to the work that a lot of other people are giving to support, and they want to be part of that. And you have an inside seat to that, a front row seat. And I would just encourage you, do your work with excellence, because that has a real impact and fruit for the kingdom.
So throughout Scripture, there are a number of patterns and seasons that we see. And I know the two of you have spent time reflecting on the concept of the year of Jubilee. Can you share a little bit more about what have you learned through that exploration, and how has that impacted the way that you give?
Yeah, our church actually did a series on the Jubilee laws and the period around that in Scripture a few years ago. And, of course, there's these things that happen every 7 years, and then every seventh 7 year. After that, the 50th year, there's a big celebration, right? And this is when assets get redistributed back, kind of snapped back. And so there's like this control on wealth, right? That gets redistributed back to the community. And so you can use assets in productive ways during that period and make more money. But there's this kind of like equalizing factor that came through the Jubilee process that kind of prevented the massive wealth gap and disparity that we often see in our world these days. And Krista and I got to thinking about what does that look like in a modern day setting, right? We may not be able to give land back and all these things, but what could it look like? What is that? How do we accomplish that same basic process of a redistribution of wealth and an equalizing factor? And so, of course, we have typically wanted to give away at least 10% of our income each year. But we thought, hey, when we turn 50, which, is only a few years from now, what if we were to give away 10% of our net worth, not just our income in that year? Well, boy, that would be a bigger deal. And that would be something we'd have to put some planning into, right? Both on the setting aside that capital and how do you give that capital wisely? And so that's been something we've been journeying on. That's something we are planning to do. We're 48 now, so we're getting closer. But yeah, it's something we've felt like could be a way we can participate in that Jubilee principle of taking some of what God's given us and redistributing back to people who are in need. And these students we're bringing to colleges is a way to do that. That will materially impact these young women and their whole families. Their ability to come and study in the United States like that, it could change everything for them. And so, that's just one way I think we're looking to take some of what God has blessed us with, not just what we make that year in income, but even some of the corpus, the body of that, and give it most generously. And it's a control on our own hearts, right? It's such an antidote to hoarding and this selfish mentality to give generously and freely and just see what God does with that.
So I'm assuming the root word of jubilee is related to our word in the English language of jubilant, or it's this joyous occasion that involves generous giving. And Krista, it just really stuck out to me when you said that you're essentially having 3 kids in college at the same time. I think often if someone were to say that, you would expect the other person to respond sympathetically of like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. That must be really tough. But you had a smile on your face. Can you share a little bit about what it's like to live with this joy of giving? Because I think in my own story, when I started giving, it was because I felt like I had to, and there was an obedience factor. I didn't have that experiential factor that the two of you, it's so evident listening to your story, but just these phrases that you keep saying. And it's like this thing you're excited about that someone else might go, oh my gosh, look how hard this is for me. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great observation, because I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right. Most people saying they've got 3 kids in higher ed, you'd say, oh my goodness, right? And yeah, it is something we're incredibly excited about. I think like you, our story, mine, I guess I should speak specifically for myself, certainly was one initially of just obedience and building a habit. And this is just what we do. It's what I do as part of this family that I'm born into, right? This is part of what I do as a Christian. So this is why I give. But it certainly has morphed into something that Jesse and I are excited about, and that we find, I think Jesse's going to maybe talk a little bit later in your manager's minute, but we talk about this notion of scheming with God. Like, how could we partner with you? What do you have for us? And, Keelan, you gave a minute ago this, like a list of different ways you can give with your time and other ways. And I think to me, what you were kind of hitting on was creativity in giving. And so sometimes, again, there's joy and fun when you're being creative and saying, yeah, maybe this is a season where we don't have as much money, but how could we, again, use what we've got? Starting many years ago when we had very little we could give, we occasionally held, if there was a cause we thought was important, we would hold a fundraising dinner and invite other people to give what they could. And so if we could just make this one meal and get people together and talking about this, we could raise money that we couldn't give out of our own pocket. But by doing this together, right, more people could give. And we did something similar to this and raised thousands of dollars just a couple of weeks ago in our home, right? And we were able to give so much more to an organization that we cared about than we could have, just by trying to write our own check. So I think when you look at an opportunity as a creative challenge, how could we do this? And again, to scheme along with God, how might you be calling us? Then there's joy in that. And then, of course, there's also joy when you see results. And, this is an interesting opportunity to be chatting about these things, because you don't usually go around saying, here's how we give and what we do and toot your own horn. These aren't things we talk about super publicly usually. But, when one of the girls who's the recipient of this particular scholarship that we're giving to cover her education, we received a video from the head of the school as this was being read to her. And it just brings tears to our eyes, right? Watching it and her joy. And as all of her classmates, they couldn't get through the letter because they just kept stopping and literally like standing and clapping and just like to see this, you think, how could not everyone want to, be able to be part of a story like this when it's just changing something so fundamental and getting to be part of a new lovely story. She started writing, hey, Dad, Jesse, right, in emails as we're working through the process of her paperwork and application and things and such. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, is it hard? Sometimes in certain ways, but mostly no, it's become a fun challenge. It's something that we do and believe in together as a couple. It's something we feel called to. And in all of those ways, you're right, it's a jubilant, a joyful part of what it means for us to live out our faith. That's for sure.
I think there's so much joy in giving. It far outweighs the loss of money. And in fact, that story she just gave about that student, I remember sitting there weeping, watching this video and thinking, what a privilege to turn something so basic, so mean as money into something eternal like this. It's incredible. What an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in a year-long reading plan, right? So we're like deep in the Old Testament somewhere right now. Just went through Judges, which is an interesting time. But, there's all these instances of God like kind of audibly talking to people and through the prophets and all this stuff. And we think today like, wouldn't it be awesome if God just audibly communicated to me and I feel like giving and generosity in general is one of the most direct, clearest ways to hear God audibly if you want to hear him, because of the things that you're talking about. I love the phrase scheming with God because it's like you're uncovering a story that God is writing. And you're like, oh, I have a role in this story. Like, I want to keep reading to figure out what's going to happen. And, it's really, when it comes down to it at a fundamental level, a rapid succession of yeses to God's prompting and the Spirit working in your life. But it doesn't feel like an obligation, command obedience kind of thing. It feels like you're unveiling a story that you're in. And that God's writing. And then that's what these kind of stories, I think, perfectly illustrate. And, everybody wants to have stories where they can say, like, look, this is all the ways that I saw God work. Giving is like the easiest way to make those stories happen. If you're like, I want a story this month that I will be telling for the next 10 years, you can realistically accomplish that. It's not like you have to just hope that you stumble into something. You can make a story this month that you will be telling for 10 years. So it's just, you guys obviously know that and are living that. But I think a lot of people miss that. And I wish more people just had a taste of it. That's why we love sharing these kind of stories, is because, just to give people a taste of like anybody can be, a part of this.
I just want to so affirm what you're saying. I love the way you've captured all of that. But also to kind of give this layer of real talk that I think sometimes when we hear other people doing whatever is the wonderful thing they're doing, or if they're athletic feat or whatever, it's like, wow, well, great for them. They can do it. When we think about foster care, or we host, Hope International interns we have kind of an apartment in our basement, all through the summers and all of this, and trying to be generous with our resources, with our home, with our time, with how we build into people, or being interruptible to go and help in various ways. There is so much joy that comes from it. It's still almost every time, it's still also a question. And it isn't always easy in the moment, even knowing, right, that the Lord is putting this opportunity here and that he's going to bless it and he'll, whatever. I'm someone who struggles often with sharing my personal space or my time. I'm deeply introverted and really love being completely alone, in complete quiet, and could do that for probably weeks before I'd almost notice that there haven't been any people around, right? And so I see this also as a way of, there's sacrifice there as well, right? To say, despite the fact that, God, you made me like I am, and I trust you know who I am. And nevertheless, you're inviting me into these opportunities to live life alongside this person or this family or this child. And so I don't want to necessarily give the impression that it's simple or that it's easy. And yet also, on the other hand, it is simple and easy. And it is a yes and trusting God to provide. So it's sort of both of those things in tension with one another. Not to say that necessarily it's easy to hand over a good deal of your finances, or easy to open up your home to something that actually is going to be really messy, or just make life incredibly complicated, or make you very exhausted, or whatever it is, or is going to hurt, or hurt maybe your own children or people you love. You're not sure how this is going to play out. Yeah, that's never a no-brainer or simple. Often that still involves, counting the cost and some sacrifice, and yet saying, God, we're looking for you to provide. Sometimes that provision and that joy and the lovely end of the story isn't quick. And we also could give some stories where it has been really painful and really hard. I mean, you sometimes look back and say, God, where exactly were you in this? We're still trusting you're going to help us see the end of that particular story. So to be kind of real in both sides of that. There's so much joy, but it's not without also trusting God for where it doesn't feel so joyful.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And you're right that it is easy to think of things as, if I'm stepping out there, God's going to bless me immediately. It's not always the way that we expect it. It's often, deeper in many ways, but not always the same way that we expect it. Before we move on to some other things, I wanted to come back to this concept of the Jubilee year that you guys have planned and just get into the practical for a second, because I'm just thinking through, liquidating 10% of net worth. There's a spiritual dimension to that, which is a challenge in its own right. And you guys have obviously already kind of gotten through that level because you're planning on taking part in this. But there's also just kind of a logistics and practical barrier to, like if you're thinking about things like a retirement account or your home equity or whatever, it's not always easy stuff to give. So I'm just love to hear, kind of your thought process, and it might even still be in process, but what are some of your kind of thoughts behind what some of that looks like?
Yeah, I'm a practical guy, so I'm happy to tackle that question. So yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, 10% of our net worth includes our home and our, retirement accounts, but I can't liquidate those at 50, right? So you're right. It's 10% of a net worth, but it's a lot bigger percent of the stuff that sits outside of those things. And so it's like I mentioned, it takes some planning, right? Like we have a National Christian Foundation donor advised fund. We're starting to build some things up as we have appreciated stock. We donate that in there and sell it within the donor advised fund to avoid some of the capital gains tax. And we're kind of building that up while giving along the way. We're not stopping the giving we're doing now, but building that up for some bigger, more catalyzing kinds of gifts that we could do. And I think about things like, maybe an endowed scholarship that could help students like we've been helping here indefinitely long into the future, right? Could be a way to give that. So helping some nonprofits do some things that just wouldn't maybe be feasible otherwise without a larger block gift like this. So yeah, it definitely takes some planning and something we have been really intentional about. It's probably been a 5-year process by the time we get to be 50 of really setting aside that money intentionally toward that end.
And practically, it's also prompting and will increasingly, as 2027 gets even closer, prompting good conversations between me and Jesse. What giving will and won't, count toward this really practically, what dollars add up and what don't, and where exactly do we want to give this, and what places would be helped by larger gifts, or where could that be problematic for certain organizations, or right. There are just lots of very detailed questions as we try to discern in conversation and prayer. How do we actually make this happen? And also other questions. Would we invite others to come along and maybe partner with us in this? How much do we or don't? Apparently now the cat's out of the bag. This is something we're doing because we've talked about it here. But it's not something we've talked a whole lot about, again, with many people. Yeah, but just lots of very specific questions we need to ask with one another, and then bringing in sometimes other people's wisdom and insight. I'm so thankful that I'm married to someone who does think in Excel, basically. We joked even early in our marriage that we needed to make him like a double, calculator holster to wear, he's always running numbers and thinking, how can we make this work? So in a lot of that practical side, he's got it all sorted. We know what we need to do and when, and I just mostly get to grin and nod and say, looks great. But some of these other questions about exactly how and what it will look like. Yeah, we've got our work cut out for us in the next 2 years and are excited to see how it plays out.
It's really cool from my perspective, just to think through. It sounds like it's not going to be one moment where you write a check for 10% of your net worth, but instead spread it out throughout the whole year. And it just reminded me of the concept of taking a sabbatical or rest from work. This is providing rest for you in the form of giving. Not only do you get the joy from the gifts, but it's you've already made peace well in advance with the idea that you're not trying to maximize net worth or returns, or it's about so much more than that. And while it may not look the way you want on a spreadsheet from the outside, you guys understand the eternal value of this currency exchange between dollars and treasure in heaven. And I think that demonstrates a life lived in pursuit of God's will for your lives.
So on a little bit of a different angle, I wanted to come to something that you guys have mentioned elsewhere before, and I just thought was really helpful, is about how you think about giving throughout the year, both actually from a giver side and from, working in a nonprofit context. You have a unique perspective into seeing how the interplay of all that works. And I think as givers, it's really easy to not think too much about when we give, because we're kind of just focused on what am I able to do now. But you guys have kind of put some thought into that, so maybe you could share just a little bit about what that looks like for you guys.
Sure. I think you're probably referring to this idea that I think for many, especially smaller organizations and nonprofits, probably any organization or nonprofit, it's really helpful for them to know what's coming, to have their regular givers, their consistent givers. And yet many of us only think about giving maybe in the end of the fourth quarter, right? Or the year-end gifts or a single one-time or year-end gift. Of course, they're not going to turn away those gifts, but often it can be helpful to have money coming in throughout. And I know that's something Jesse talks about as well through his work at Hope. For us, we give, as Jesse just mentioned, through a donor-advised fund and have for a bunch of years now. And so what that means, well, there's a couple things. Practically, one way that helps us, especially with changes in, the standard deduction rate and being so high right now, we can kind of save up and put a lot of money in a single year into the donor advised fund so that we can, exceed the standard deduction every few years. But then it means we've got money in there to give away or bleed out more regularly, both serendipitously when a need that you don't expect comes in front of you and you decide, wow, should we be doing something about this need we just heard in church, or we've just heard through a friend or whatever. We have something already set aside and we don't have to wait to save that up. And it also means that we are able to schedule giving monthly or quarterly or whatever along the way. I mean, not have to think as much about that or kind of do it all in one big lump sum when it crosses our mind, or maybe in December or something like that. Would you add anything to that, Jesse?
Yeah, maybe from the nonprofit perspective, this is a big deal. I can't tell you how much of our income at Hope International comes in the last month of the year, the last week of the year, the last few days of the year. And our fiscal year end is December 31st. So, we get a snapshot of our cash position on December 31st. And guess what? It's really high. It's our high watermark for the year, right? And then donors the whole rest of the year are saying, why would you got all this money? It's like, well, you gave us 2 days to spend it, so I think it can be so helpful for nonprofits to be able to plan and utilize that money much more efficiently when you have it coming in, regularly throughout the year. And especially if you already got that money in a donor advised fund. Like, look, it's already charity anyway. Like, why not give it throughout the year and not wait till, December 29th?
Yeah, donor advised fund is such a perfect tool for that. It really unlinks when you get your deduction and when you do your giving. And
Yes.
Ideally, you're not leaving the money in that limbo forever, but it definitely helps for what exactly the problem that you're talking about. And for charitable bunching, which you were talking about, Krista, of trying to, if you're not hitting the standard deduction each year, so you're really not getting credit for all your giving, then you can lump it all together every few years and get a big tax deduction that year, and ultimately a big net savings on that strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can give more.
Yeah, you can give me more. And the charity doesn't have to see that, right? All the charity sees is still that monthly coming in, that bunching happens with the donor advised fund.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've really enjoyed hearing some of your stories. I'm sure you have many, many more, but I'd like to just take a minute and hear from each of you what you're most excited about in the next 5 or 10 years.
We've got some question marks for the future and also exciting things. We are in a phase where we've got 2 teenagers, one who is about to graduate from high school in just a few months, one who's a freshman. So over the next 5 to 10 years, life is going to look really, really different. I mean, goodness, by the time they're 25 and 28, a decade from now, could be grandkids. Life is going to really change a lot in this next decade. And a lot of it feels unknown yet as it's going to play out. Up to this point, it's felt like a lot of our life is in, and the plans and the decisions we make have been in our hands. As our children become adults, it's going to be interesting to see how that also shapes who we are and what we do. And there have been some changes in some of the ways actually related to giving. One of our alma mater, a beloved recipient of our giving quite heavily through the past few years closed in this past year. And that's been really destabilizing to us. Much of our giving, much of the time we spent, the things that got us really excited about saving and then sending support their way. With that off the table, it puts another question mark in the future. As we're excited to see, not with specificity, this is exactly what I'm excited about for the future, but more, I'm excited to see how God fills that need and plants some new passions in our heart and some new places that we can support. But right now, at least for me, I have in many ways almost more question marks before me than I ever have at any point in my life over what these next 5 to 10 years might look like. And I'm a type A, planful, worrying kind of person. So just trying to look at those question marks and be excited and okay with that in the moment is something I'm working on instead of feeling fretful. But the Lord's working on me in that, and we'll see what comes of it.
Yeah, I mentioned that Hope's mission is investing in the dreams of families in the world's underserved communities as we proclaim and live the gospel. And we talk a lot about that language of dreams. What are we dreaming? And we especially love to hear from the people we serve around the world. What are their dreams for themselves, for their future, for their families? And sometimes I think about the same language for us. Like, what do our dreams look like? I mean, I think at our stage of life, so often your dreams kind of center around your kids and what they're doing and where they're going. And that's all about the change, in the next few years. And, like Krista said, we're kind of wondering, how do our dreams morph and change with our kids kind of launching into their own lives and their own future? What does the next half look like for us? And I think we have some ideas, but also some uncertainty, and we're open to what God has for us in that. I also, some of these students we're connecting with and or some of the families that we've been involved with foster care, I really love going deep on relationship. And so I'm looking forward to getting to know those young women better, to getting to know their families better and connecting with them. Maybe some of the kids will be involved with foster care. We love to, where possible, have a longer term relationship with them. And we have one of the first kids we had is actually coming over for dinner this weekend. She's now in her 20s. And, I love that ability to have that long term relationship. And so I look forward to that, and I'm excited about continuing to do that.
Yeah, Krista, you're talking about this kind of question mark season coming up. I think that is the first chapter of some of the coolest stories that I've heard. People being like, I kind of found myself in an open period. We were like, all right, where are you going to go, God? And then some really cool stories come out of that. And so I'm excited to see what he holds next in store for you guys. It's certainly been an eventful first half for you, for sure. As we get to the end of the episode, we want to leave some time for our manager's minute. And it's just a practical suggestion we leave for our listeners at the end of every episode. So Jesse and Krista, do you have a suggestion for our listeners today?
Yeah, and Krista mentioned earlier about the scheming principle. There's this wonderful sermon by Tim Keller. I mean, so much wonderful material from Tim Keller, but this sermon called Two Men with Money. And I would highly recommend if you haven't listened to it. And one of the men is Zacchaeus, and he tells this story about Zacchaeus sitting down with Jesus after Jesus came to his house to have a meal with him. And he said, "Look, Lord," almost like a little child, right? Like, "Look, I was thinking, what if I give away half my wealth, and then anybody I cheat out of money, I'm going to repay him 4 times the amount, And Jesus looks at him and says, "Yeah, I like that. That's good. That's creative." And, Tim Keller's talking about like, hey, we got the rich young ruler. Jesus told him to give away 100%. Zacchaeus gives away 50%. Is it 10%, 50%, 100%? What's the number? Just tell me the number that I need to do to be okay with God. And he's saying the wrong question, right? We need to churn that perspective from a minimalist. What's the minimum I have to do to be okay with God? And churn into the glory that is Jesus and say, how much can I do? He's done so much for me already. How much can I give back to delight him and to increase his kingdom? And so I would encourage you, scheme with God. Be open to what the Holy Spirit has for you and be thinking, God, what are we up to this year? What can we do together?
Yeah, I love that. Another dangerous question to ask, I think, because that's, going to lead you to some crazy places if you start down that trail. Well, Jesse, Krista, this has been so much fun. Thank you for sharing some of your life and story with us and for just all the ways that God is working in and through you. I am excited to see what is next and what he has in store.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 140. Before we finish up, I have a quick question for you. Have you ever stopped to answer the question, how much is enough? A financial finish line is designed to help you do just that. Our 90-day Finish Line Pledge breaks down the process into 3 easy steps. Step 1, define how much is enough for you and your family to spend in a single month, and use that as your monthly spending budget for 90 days. Step 2, as God provides money to manage, set aside any margin outside of your finish line into a separate bank account. Step 3, after 90 days, explore the many ways you can use the margin you've set aside to create joy, purpose, and impact in God's kingdom. Want to learn more? Check out our website at finishlinepledge.com. That's all we have for today. We'll see you next time.